One of the questions or comments I get the most is that people feel like they lose in deployment quite frequently. And that is something that I've had pop up twice this week, and not even just in coaching sessions. This was just in, messages to someone that I've been talking to for a little while, just about the game in general. But it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and I think you can approach the way you deploy and have a good idea of how to deploy your army in quite a formulaic way. And that's not to say this is the highest level of deployment, but I think it's a good way that if you're struggling with deployment, you can kind of solve the issue you're having in terms of not knowing where to put things, and then you can take that brain space that you're using in terms of trying to work out what the hell you're doing with your models and put it towards how to beat your opponent. This video is brought to you by my coaching patron. Obviously, something that I do is working with people individually. Did work with Team England through the 2025 season, and I'm currently working with the Dutch Lions for the international team event that they're doing in just a couple of weeks' time. Looking forward to bringing some content about that your way. But if you are interested in, learning more about the game, maybe breaking down the mistakes that you're making, looking at why you make the mistakes, looking at how to improve, outside of just sort of videos that try to scattershot tell the whole picture as much as possible, then you can go to the Patreon that is linked down below, patreon.com/close order, where I do individual coaching, either 3-hour sessions where you typically look at playing a game, or 1-hour sessions where you typically look at either event prep or looking at list building on a more structured basis. The first thing I would do is, the first video I put out in the series was how to score strategic objectives. A lot of this is going to build on that sort of premise, so the video is in the same playlist as this video. I'll have it linked at the end, or you can just find it on the channel there. But if you're not sure how to approach scoring strategic locations, we're going to talk about that a little bit in here, but there is a full video breaking that one down on the channel as well. So the first thing we're going to be looking at is how do we score, or how do we want to position ourselves for success? And a lot of that's going to come down to the objectives that we got, but not every mission does have objectives. So we're going to start off with drawn battle lines, because this is, in my mind, what sort of default old world has become. You've got, 3 locations in the center of the board. Yes, the deployment is diagonal instead of flat, but it's not really that much of a difference. And all you need to do is adjust your mental angle on the looking at the board. It doesn't actually make a huge difference in terms of how the board is played, other than, the ability to put stuff like war machines further back in the back corner, or having to screen out the back corner as well. Okay, with drawn battle lines, most things are going to be fixed turn limit. This, we're looking at the match play guide. It's been out now for about, I think, 6 months, 4 to 6 months, something in there. Someone can do the maths. And we've pretty much settled on fixed turn limit just being the standard. Most places are going to be playing 6 rounds of combat. And I think knowing that going in does change how your deployment works, but we're not going to talk about it much because it doesn't really make a difference here. Not many people play random game length, as far as I'm aware anyway. In terms of reserves, they don't come in at the start of battle. They come in during the compulsory reserves moves, and that's just in terms of, both players roll off at the start of the game. If either player rolls a 1, both players put a single unit, which is either infantry or cavalry, into reserve. Does this make a difference? Most of the time, no. The only time this really makes a difference is if you're playing some sort of big Death Star as your only infantry unit, in which case I would say maybe you need to tweak your list a little bit if you go into a tournament that has drawn battle lines in. If you're playing against your opponent, and they've only got a single infantry unit or a single cavalry unit, they've got 1 big Death Star, make sure that neither of you forget this rule, because it does make a huge difference, and is the sort of thing that you have to think about when designing your list. You don't want to, get ruined by someone who's made a greedy choice in their army list design without thinking about the ramifications. Anyway, this doesn't come up all that much realistically. It comes with Strategic Locations 3 and may have Domination and or baggage trains. So if we just very quickly talk about Domination and how that's going to affect your scoring in general, if you're playing Domination, you're probably going to play either more cagey or more aggressive than you normally would. It skews your playstyle more than you're used to, I would say, in terms of how you would normally approach playing the game. How do I mean? Well, if I've got an army that is kind of a combined arms list, it's got some melee, it's got some shooting, I'm probably going to try and pick off enemy units and then see what I can do. But if my opponent's playing a very aggressive list, Domination's going to make me want to play more defensive, make it so it's harder for them to pick off anything, so I've got more units at the end of the game that I can move out to try and hold things. So with Domination, the way that it works, obviously, is if you're holding table quarters, you score points, depending on how aggressively you're holding it, whether you have it uncontested, if you have double the unit strength, or if you're just holding it and you're contested, but they have between, your unit strength +1 and your unit strength doubled -1. That's where it's going to come in. So what you're going to find is you're going to try and keep things more safe, and you're often going to put bigger units more towards extreme ends of the board, or you're going to sort of clump up in the center. So with Domination, I'll often find if I'm playing against someone aggressive, I will put all of my units quite centrally, because then I am bunkered up. I'm not losing models, being picked off by something that's fast and very hard hitting. Maybe they've got dragons that can chase down solo units, but don't really want to approach like a big spiky death ball in the center of the board. But because I'm in the center of the board, I can very easily hold at least 2 quarters of the board. I can move out at the end of, turn 4, turn 5, turn 6, whenever I want to move out. I can maybe move some faster units into the other quarters of the board when they're safe, whether that's like a Wyvern or a unit of cavalry or whatever. Something that you might want to move up turn 5, or if you're going second, turn 6 is very strong. Just getting them up there into the other board quarters can be something that's very powerful to do. So deployment with Domination, we're not going to talk about that necessarily throughout the course, so I just wanted to very briefly touch on it. But you're more likely to bunch up if your opponent's aggressive, or if you're the if you're the aggressive player, you want to be, playing more aggressive. You're going to be more on the line. You're going to be trying to table your opponent faster, or putting more work into tabling your opponent, while then still trying to pin them in their board zone, or trying to pin them in a corner so that you can get those big swings at the end of the game. Moving on, back to drawn battle lines. So this is, in my mind, as I've said, the sort of default old world experience. You're 24 inches away from your opponent. Yes, you're at an angle instead of being straight. That doesn't actually really make that much difference. It just skews you a little bit more over to the left, but we'll talk about that as we get to each of the maps. This is one where you've got a very clear neutral objective that you hold. Again, this is sort of building on the stuff we talked about, the strategic locations, but in terms of just a very quick refresher, the neutral objective is this one here, if you're on this side, because you're going to be able to hold it from your deployment zone. It's much harder for your opponent to get to it. I've deleted that as well. What a pain in the backside. So you've got your objective here. You're able to hold it very comfortably from your side. You're within range here. Because you start within 6 inches of the 6-inch bubble that you can score kind of goes like that. So you can hold it from your deployment zone. Even if you go second, you can get points. And that means immediately 1 step in our deployment is solved. We have to put a core scoring unit there. Otherwise, your opponent is going to get points on the other side of the board. They're going to start off with a 30-point advantage. They might start off with a 60-point advantage. They might start off with a 90-point advantage. If you don't move over to that objective immediately, you're going to be giving up points. So let's just start off with a unit here. Nice and easy. So again, we've got our neutral objective here that we're going to hold. Our opponent has got their neutral objective that they're going to hold. And then we've got one objective in the center, which we're going to fight over. And that one is the one that we want to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success with. So how are we thinking about this in terms of general approach? You're going to, when you're building your list, and this is something that I talk about a lot when we do the sort of fix my list, or just sort of generally talking about list construction, you want to make sure that you've got some sort of unit that can hold an off objective without having to commit too many points to it. That can be something like peasant archers. It can be a unit of very cheap infantry like zombies, or men at arms, or you could go, if you're playing renegade crowns, it can be a unit of handgunners with, heavy armor and shields. It doesn't have to be cheap, but you want it to be not your main focus. It's probably not taking up more than 150 to 200 points of your core. Realistically, it's going to cost less than that, and you might take a couple of them, but you're going to want some sort of unit that can hold your natural objective, or just the safe objective on your deployment, whatever that deployment is going to be. So let's say we're playing, I don't know, Beastmen, and we've got a unit of 15 Ungor. You're going to start off with that unit of 15 Ungor here. I really like skirmishers for this sort of deployment. Often what you'll find, and this is obviously something that changes from, what terrain you've got, who your tournament organizer is, who you're playing with, what sort of terrain you've got available to you, all of that. But quite often I'll find that there's a wood sort of around here, whether it's that far forwards or maybe it's a little bit further back. It might be like this, something along those lines. If you're playing a skirmishing unit of infantry, or really any infantry, but I think skirmish does this job better, you can be in range of the objective here by sort of just being, skirmished and also towed into the woods. If you're a skirmish unit that's towed into the woods on the flank, you're going to be -1 to hit for being skirmish, you're going to be -1 to hit for being touching light cover, for being in the wood. You're probably going to be -1 to be hit from ballistic skill shooting for long range as well, because you're 24 inches away from your opponent. So by doing this, you've got a quite safe flank unit holding here that can sit into there, and your opponent's probably not super likely to put a huge amount of pressure into you, because people do often default to putting their armies more heavily towards the side of the board where they've got more space. So people are less likely to put heavy threat. You're not so super likely to put all your heavy cavalry and a dragon here. Maybe you don't have good objective scoring and you're going to try and stop your opponent from scoring as opposed to scoring yourself. But the general premise remains, usually you can hold this objective with a small unit. So let's say in this case, we're going to put down a unit of Ungor. And again, we don't have to put these units down first. We're just talking about them first because these are the ones that are important to know where they go. Typically, in my mind, when I'm thinking about deployment, there are 3 units that have sort of set places, and then everything else has good places to go. And then there are some things that just sort of go down either as filler drops or as how I might want to approach, trying to bait things going down on the other side. But just as a general premise, you want things to go down that can hold objectives, you want things that can go down that can threaten enemy objectives, and everything else kind of works from there. So we've put down our unit of Ungor, fantastic. That's going to hold the off objective, the neutral objective, amazing. Our next key unit is if we're playing Beastmen, we've probably got a big core unit of Gore that we're going to put some characters in. That's something that we want to use more aggressively. It's, 350 points. We've got 400 to 700 points worth of characters in there. This is not a unit that we can afford to have just sitting in the back lines doing nothing. We want it to make sure that it's holding something that our opponent's going to try and contest. We're going to get value out of it. So we're going to put that nice and easy opposite the objective that's going to be contested. Super simple stuff. And I think once people, typically when I do coaching with people on this, once they've got the basic premise of this, I think coaching typically falls into place. So we're talking a lot about this one. I think this is Drawn Battle Lines is the best objective to show it on, or the best map to show it on. But it's a lot of the same. It's very formulaic. We're putting a small scoring unit near the objective that's easier to hold. We're putting a big scoring unit opposite the objective that's going to be more contested. Pretty straightforward stuff. The next thing to look at is not just the things that are going to score your objectives, but the units that are going to support them or contest your opponent. So obviously, your opponent is going to be doing very similar to you on the other side of the board. So maybe they've got their own small unit that's off here. Maybe it's some peasant archers, and they've got a big brick of, Yeoman Guard over here. So they're going to look to try and contest in the center as well. You're both doing the same thing. I'm going to delete those just to make it more visually clear to read. But, your opponent's doing the same thing on the opposite side of the board, typically. This is generally how I find people play the game out. So if you've got units that you want to use to threaten those objectives, so maybe in terms of Beastmen, you've got a couple of giant spawn. Where do you want to put the giant spawn? There's a few places you can put them. You can put them here. And by doing so, if you're worried about people putting pressure onto this side of the board here, if you think your opponent's going to get more aggressive, you can use the giant spawn to secure this objective while also moving up to project force into the center of the board. So if you're worried about the top side of the board or the left side of the board here, having them on the left is a good place to do so. And you can come over like this and still threaten the center of the board, sort of turn 3 onwards. If that's not where you need them to be, maybe you want to cover both of your objectives. You think that your opponent is more aggressive than you, so you want to have support to support the 2 objectives that you're going to try and hold. Let's get rid of where they were. Maybe they sit in here. Amazing. Immediately, you can come up here, you can threaten this way, you can threaten this way. Very easy to support both of the objectives that you can hold. And if you're not sure, I'd say this is probably your default. This is if you think your opponent's going to put pressure on you and you want to be able to respond to that instead of you thinking that you need to put pressure down. Okay, great. What if you think that you're going to be more aggressive? Beastmen, if we're going with our example, Beastmen are typically quite an aggressive army. So maybe you put them down here, and at this point you can still help contest in the center, you can also threaten the right-hand side objective as well. So their natural objective or neutral objective that they're thinking they don't have to put a lot of resistance into, suddenly those 15 peasant archers are going to be moved into by a random mover that's, toughness 6 and is going to stomp them to death. That's probably quite strong as well. You also don't have to overcommit. You've got 2 giant spawn, amazing. Maybe we've got one here so we can respond to both sides, and we've got one here because we want to put pressure on our opponent. Or we've seen our opponent put down a lot of threat. So if I just put this gold brick back where it is, you can put them, one here and one here. That still gives you some ability to push over this way if you need to, but realistically, you're mostly looking at covering this section of the board by having them more over to the left. Again, super simple stuff, but just worth thinking about in terms of how you want to present. But, if in doubt, maybe you just put them in the center like here, a couple of giant spawn able to respond to most of the map, or one on both sides. I think my preference would actually be something like this in this scenario that we've got. Cool. So we've got our giant spawn, we've got our gore, we've got our own gore down. This is a big chunk of our list. Obviously, you've got to think about where the characters go, but aside from that, what else have we got? Well, we've got a lot of chaff drops. In this case, we're going to have a herdstone to hold. You don't always have a herdstone. You might not be playing Beastman, but maybe you've got, your herdstone's here. You want to use it to project threat forwards, so you're probably going to have it a little bit more towards us here. Maybe using Beastman was a bad idea. But, you've got a little smiley face there where we've put the herdstone in the center. Again, we're using this to represent, so you want to have more threat over the center. In fact, let's just completely ignore everything I said about the herdstone, because that's just going to add an extra layer of complexity that we don't need. Let's move on instead to, after I put this gigantic spawn back, let's move on to the chaff drops. So you might have, in fact, most armies I think have these. Not every army. Some armies will go for the lowest number of drops as possible, and by doing so, they will pretty consistently get the +1 to go first. That's really nice if you're a very aggressive army or if you've got a lot of shooting. I think the value of going first is lower than it was previously. Obviously, you can choose to go second, but typically you're pushing for that +1 so you can get that first turn as much as possible. And the reason that I think the value of the going first has dropped is because we actually have scoring objectives that score at the end of the game, and going second in those matchups is nice. So the +1 is nice, but I think it's got variable strength. So let's talk about chaff drops. If you've got stuff like Razor Gore, Razor Gore, Tusk Chariots, anything that is not going to, you're not going to put it down and it's going to charge the enemy. It's not a straightforward unit to use. You're not using it to just put it into the front of a unit and win combat. It's not a unit of heavy cavalry. It's not a unit of, it's not a Death Star or anything like that. Chaff drops, you might think, are going to do a couple of different things. The first is if you want them to do stuff like move blocking or charge redirecting or frenzy baiting or protecting your own units from frenzy. Those ones are quite easy to position. You just put them kind of centrally, because if you're looking to frenzy bait, maybe you put something here and you're going to have it run over here. So then when it runs away from the frenzy unit, you're going over there. Pretty simple stuff. But typically, if you want to move block, you want it to be central. So if we're talking stuff like a unit of marching column dire wolves for Warriors of Chaos, they vanguard forwards to here. Then they can come up and just sort of literally sit in front of enemies like this and make it really hard for them to get past. Again, you position so that when you flee off at an odd angle and your opponent doesn't have a redirect charge. All of these things are good to use. So I think talking about those is more talking about the utility of single units as opposed to breaking it down to what should we do with chaff drops. So if you've got something that you're going to use as a march blocker, or if you've got something that you're going to use to, physically intersperse, or you're going to frenzy bait, you probably know what you want to do with it. And working backwards from that is very easy. But at default, have them probably quite central so they're not too far away from the enemy unit, because that way you're able to put them where you need to go. Assuming we're not using them for specifically that use, if you've got chaff drops that you want to put down in terms of baiting out your opponent, or in terms of just waiting to see what your opponent's going to do, Beastmen are a great example here because they do this very well. Stuff like Razor Gore, maybe we're going to go one Razor Gore here. And they, they're relatively fast. They move 7 inches. So even if your opponent deploys entirely over here, you can go 14 inches, turn 1, 28 inches, turn 2. And then by turn sort of 2 or by the start of turn 3 or 4, you're threatening to come in and charge if they're bunkered up, or you can just come around and, try and do stuff to the back of the objective that's contested. So as long as the unit that you're using on the flank is relatively fast, you're not actually losing that much. So you might have one Razor Gore here, you might put the second Razor Gore here, you might put the third Razor Gore in here, just really keeping your opponents guessing, putting them down early, getting the information from your opponent without really giving up any information yourself. And the ordering here is where we start thinking about it. So you want to know where your units go. So you want to know that you're going to put the Ungor down opposite this objective. You want to know that you're going to put down the Gore Brick opposite the contested objective. So you don't need to put them there. You know how much space you're going to need to leave. You don't have to measure it out necessarily. You just need to eyeball it and go, I can definitely fit 6 or 7 ranks here. Perfect. We're going to leave that space. Jobs are good. If you're worried about it, do measure out what the distance is and then measure to make sure you left yourself some gaps. It does make it quite obvious what you're doing, but I think, frankly, once you understand how to deploy, if you're playing against other people who understand how to deploy, you often know that they're going to mirror. They're going to do the same thing with their sort of list. You're going to identify the units that's going to go for the natural objective, that's going to go for the contested objective. So you can usually work out where your opponent's going to put stuff even before, they put the stuff down as well. Last but not least, we have, the characters. And this is really reducing down the list to sort of the base concepts, but I think you can do that to most armies. So if we go with stuff like the characters here, where are we going to put them? Well, if it's dragons, for example, obviously this was initially a beastman list, but let's say you've got a couple of dragons, you can do a couple of things with them. They've got a lot of movement. If you don't know where your dragon should go, keep them central. If they're central, they can respond to where you need them to be on the board. They can march 20 inches. Jobs are good in there. What about buffing characters? Well, buffing characters should go centrally. If you want them to go in with a unit that's specifically getting buffed, so if you've got like a demonology wizard, they should go in with the unit that you want to cast spells on. That's very obvious, but it's worth just mentioning here. Battle Standard Bearer should probably go pretty centrally. Where should they go inside units? That's something that's important about, thinking about where things should go. My general approach with characters going in units is if it's going to be a character that is squishy, so a Battle Standard Bearer or wizard that doesn't necessarily want to be in combat with something that's quite difficult to kill, either on the corner or I've started going second rank in. So something like that I quite like. So you've got one model on the corner, which means that if you get flank charged, you're not getting punched, but you're still far enough over that you're going to be hit theoretically less. You're less likely to have, enemy models hitting you. Where do you go? Like, which side do you choose? I usually look at what my opponent's done. So if I've got like a Battle Standard Bearer or a wizard in a unit and my opponent's got their big threatening unit over here, well, I'm going to put my wizard or my BSB on the opposite side of the unit, make it harder for them to end up in base to base. You've always got time to reposition characters in units as long as you can do a reform or something like that, because between them moving into a threatening position to here and then charging you, you've always got time to make a move, reform or whatever. And by reforming, if your wizard was over here, you could do reform, spin, change the angle of the unit, but then end up over on the other side of the unit so that they're not going to end up in base-to-base contact with you. So, general premise, squishy stuff towards the edge of a unit on the opposite side of the unit to where your opponent's deployed their big threats, as a just general rule to follow. What about big heavy hitters? So again, going back to Beastmen, let's say we've got a Minotaur Lord in there, got the Blades of Kargath, Axe of Kargath, the one that gives you extra attacks. You've got an absolute blender of a character, and you want to make sure that you're going to get into the action. Should you be on the edge of a unit? Should you be one from the edge of the unit? No to both of those. Why? Because you cannot move through the fighting rank of a unit, and unless, if you're in a fighting rank already, you cannot move through a fighting rank. Characters specifically, not unit champions, have a rule where at the start of combat they can move into the fighting rank if they are not already in it. So, we want the character to be as central as possible, and the reason we're as central as possible is it means that we're in a position where we are likely to be able to hit anything that hits us in the front. If we're in the center of the unit, it's very hard for someone to make contact with us. Remember, when you charge, you have to make contact with as many models as possible while moving the minimum of distance, so you know where your opponent's going to end up unless they get a really low roll and they can only sort of clip on the corner here. If that happens, unlucky. But realistically, you know that they have to be in base to base with this character. As long as you're in the center of the unit, it's very difficult to avoid them. So Great place to put them there. But by not being in any of the external ranks, and I mean not just one rank, but 2 ranks, because remember, infantry, if it doesn't charge, have 2 fighting ranks. As long as you are 3 from the left or 3 from the right, you can always move into the fighting rank as long as you're not in combat. So in this situation here, where we've got the, the Doom Ball in this little spot there, let's say we get charged in this flank, we're able to move into the fighting rank, suddenly we're able to fight. Amazing. So characters that want to fight, central as possible, outside of, the 2 ranks on the side in case you get flank charged, and less fighty characters more to the side. Because you don't care about moving to the fighting rank necessarily. You more just want them to be, stuck in and not getting killed by the enemy Blender Lord. Okay, so we kind of talked about a lot of unstructured things there, just the general premises, or premises, maybe? General premise of how I think about I'm going to be setting up my deployment. So let's talk about actually relating to drawn battle lines. Done it again. So, drawn battle lines. If it has domination, you probably want to be trying to get, some of your models over here. Let's make that more visible. We'll go pink and a bit bigger. Yeah, you're going to have some of your models over here. You're going to have some of your models. The bulky models are going to be deploying here, and you want to be able to move up there. If you can contest 3/4 of the board, you don't have to do it from turn 1, but you have to be in position to think about doing it. So maybe you deploy more centrally like so. You're going to put your army here. You're ready to hold this. You're holding this already. And then you've got something that's able to come around and able to come over here. And that will help you start to score domination from later turns of the game. The biggest mistake I think you can do, and the hardest thing to do with domination, is you should start thinking about it from deployment. If you start thinking about it on turn 5, when you go, oh crap, it's domination, you've lost domination. You're probably not getting enough points out of it, and then your opponent can make a big comeback. If you think about it from deployment, if you think about it at the end of turn 1, if you think about it at the end of turn 2, you'll remember that you don't have to overcommit units. You don't have to full send everything necessarily. Maybe that's the right choice, but think about whether you want to hold things back, whether you want to have a unit that can get up here. Maybe that unit of Warhounds that you normally use to march block or to physically block, maybe you're not going to get a lot of value out of it. Perhaps just keep it behind another unit or behind terrain and then keep it in marching column. And on turn 5, you march it up behind a hill that's over here. And suddenly, boom, contesting a quarter or holding a quarter, depending on what level of threat projection you've got for the rest of the map. So, outside of domination, baggage train. If you're holding a baggage train, if you want to play defensively, typically you're going to want your baggage train back in this sort of corner. The other place that you could put it is pretty comfortably anywhere sort of along this back line, depending on how you want to skew your army. But typically, there's usually going to be some piece of terrain, probably around here. You probably want your baggage train around here. And then the unit that's holding this objective is going to be sort of sat like this, maybe skewed so that it's touching the wood or touching, whatever. And it's going to be in range of the objective here. And then turn 6 of the game, it can also hold the baggage train. Jobs are good. Something like that. Sometimes you'll see in tournament packs that you can only hold a single objective with a single unit. That makes a lot of sense. I believe the way that works is, and this is not rules as written, this is TO's discretion. I feel like a unit that's holding a baggage train here could hold both the objective and the baggage train, because they hold the objective through the game, and then at the end of the game they don't need to hold the objective, and they hold the baggage train. I think that's how it works. If your tournament pack says you can only hold one thing at a time, just double check with your TO. But generally, having your baggage train back here to be held by the sort of cheaper core unit is a good place to have it. And yeah, other than that, you typically want to skew more heavily towards this part of your deployment zone. It's where the bulk of the space is. It's where the bulk of your objectives that you want to threaten are. And you might want to put some sort of token threat over here, or heavier threat again. If you're low on scoring units and your opponent has an abundance of them, you know that you need to bring the violence. So maybe at that point, that's where you start going more over to the right. You're going to be over here instead of on the other side. And then you put your token unit to threaten this, because you couldn't hold it anyway. Just try and stop them from scoring. Moving on to Fields of Glory. Now, this is the most changeable one. You can have so many things. Look at that. So you start off with no special rules as required. You can have baggage train special features, domination, strategic locations, 2, 3, or 4. So there's a lot of different things you can do. We're not going to talk about domination again. We've talked about that already. This is a good one where you can, deploy quite centrally, and then over the course of the game, just move out as you need to. So it's very easy to sort of keep things generally clumped up in the center, and that's just going to be domination in general. That's my general approach. As long as you've got relatively fast-moving units. If you're playing dwarves, I'm sorry, you have to start a little bit more spread out. That's unfortunate for you and your short legs. My apologies. Strategic Locations 2 is the one that I often see on here, which gives you an objective here and an objective here. I think this is really dull, and I think it does a little bit of a handshake in terms of you're going to hold yours, your opponent's going to hold theirs. Yes, you can take it off your opponent. If you put a lot of pressure on, you can come in, you can take this away from them, and somehow hold yours. That is doable. That's fine. That's something that is possible to do. But it just becomes a win-more situation. If you were winning already because you'd tabled your opponent and you'd killed most of their army, so you've got this one available to take, amazing. It's a win-more. Typically in a balanced game, you're going to hold yours, your opponent's going to hold theirs, and you're not going to be able to take them off it too easily. So what are we thinking about in terms of deployment? Well, this is where we maybe talk about terrain. Obviously, terrain comes into effect on every board, but if you've got terrain here, maybe you think about, oh, do I want to snake around the side so that I can hold it relatively safe from enemy shooting? Because this is a game of attrition as opposed to a game of where we're trying to put pressure on certain points. We're more trying to wear our opponents down, I find, in Strategic Locations 2. So yeah, if we're playing Strategic Locations 2, what are we doing? We're playing around the terrain, but we're still probably putting most of our forces here. We're putting stuff that can respond to flank attacks if needs be. If we go back to the example with the Beastmen, after I put the objective back here for our opponent, if we're talking about Beastmen, you know, maybe we've got those. That's too far out. Maybe we've got the giant spawn, one on each flank, something like this. I like running them, depending on my opponent's army, you can run them solo, but I like running them together a lot of the time as like an overwhelm pressure sort of idea. But you're probably going to put everything in the sort of center here, so having the gigantic spawn able to respond to flanking threats, not a bad shout there. We're going to put the bulk of our army in the center here. We're going to put that big gore brick here, and if we're sending anything forwards, it's going to be that. We're going to put the ungore here to hold the objective. Again, super formulaic, everything kind of just sits in the center, and the main thing you want to look for is just not overlapping in any ways that's going to cause you problems. Don't put, you know, the giant spawn in front of a unit that you think might need to charge on turn 1 if your opponent gets aggressive. Conversely, don't put your giant spawn behind a unit of infantry, because then when it comes to compulsory moves, you go, oh, I can't move this unit at all. I'm just stuck where I am. That's no good to man nor beast. So it's very simple, very boring, honestly. I don't think there's a huge amount to talk about here, other than you're probably looking to be pretty central. If you're going to put any pressure forwards, it's going to be whatever your core unit is that has the most pressure. Or this is a good example to, or not a good example, a good opportunity to get good value out of something like Dragon Princes. They're not able to hold this objective, but if you're holding yours and you're keeping 80% of your army here, but that big unit of Dragon Princes comes up and puts pressure on that objective, sure. That's the sort of thing that you can get value out on this deployment. So I don't think there's a huge amount to go for. The main thing to think about is this is one where you might find strategic locations. Not strategic locations, special features. What do we want to care about with special features? Going second. If you can get the second roll, amazing. If you win the second roll, you probably want to take it. You know, the who goes first roll, you probably want to take it and opt to go second. If your opponent picks, hope that they pick second, because going second on strategic locations just gives you a much easier time of getting those 200 points. So that's what you want to think about there. If your opponent, you know, if strategic locations is on the board, and we can use this as an opportunity to talk about this in terms of deployment in general, if you're going first, you probably have to be more aggressive. So again, if we're being aggressive, we're putting our unit that wants to be aggressive here. We're backing them up with maybe another unit here or here. You want to just consolidate your forces, and you want to put overwhelming pressure around the central point. You want to make it so it's hard for your opponent to stay in the center, and you want to make it so that anytime they come forward, you're able to beat them back. You probably also, towards the end of the game, want to physically block them if you can. If you can put a unit between, you know, them and the objective, amazing. It's going to be very, very difficult for them to take it off you in one turn. But special feature, try and go second. It's technically not a deployment tip, but it's the roll-off for deployment. So think about it there, and move up more aggressively if you're going first. With the vanilla drudgery of Fields of Glory out the way, King of the Hill is the next one to think about, and this is a contentious one, in my opinion. I think King of the Hill is fine, but the problem is, it really rewards armies that are good. Undead are very, very good at it. Exiles, Bretonia are very good at it. Anything that's got very solid core scoring, this is where you're going to get a lot of value out of it. The way that it works is the hill is controlled by a unit that is within 9 inches of the center of the battlefield, that has unit strength 10 or more, not fleeing, not stupid, but it's the closest unit, and if 2 units are equally close, it's the highest unit strength. So you want to be playing around the center of the board. This has a deployment zone that literally forces you to be more central, but, joke's on them, we were going to do that anyway. You don't want to be on the outskirts for this. You can play this with baggage train and special features. I have seen people play it with special features on here, which is spicy because you're not only getting the 200 points a turn, 100 points at the end of each player turn for the hill. So over the course of the game, if you hold it for all 6 turns, you're getting 1,200 points, which is huge. But also there's the special feature in the center of the board, which does block movement, so it makes it more interesting playing around that. But more importantly, it gives you like magic resist or unbreakable, whatever buff that you roll on the table. If you remember to roll, I find it incredibly hard to remember that it does anything until the end of the game, to be honest. But it also gives you an extra 200, 250 points, whatever it is at the end of the game as well. So it makes playing around the center really, really important. So how are we playing around the center? Again, we're just putting our core unit in. Let's assume there's a special feature here. We're going to put our core unit not in the center. We're going to put it slightly off to the side. We're going to put it here, or we're going to put it here. Why are we doing this? Because you don't want to lose movement having to pivot around here. So if you put your unit directly in the center like this, you can walk up to contest. Great. You can touch the special feature. Cool. But then what if your opponent's also doing that and they have higher unit strength? Or what if your opponent then charges you in the flank, or you're giving up a lot of mobility. So what you want to do is get sort of as close as possible to the edge of your deployment zone and then just walk forwards like so on either side. Not mind-blowing, but just remember not to go centrally. I think this is the mistake that I see people doing the most on this map, and it might just be that we don't have people play it very often. It's something that people often don't put into tournament packs. But yeah, definitely make sure you're slightly offset to the side. You also don't have to be on the hill to hold it, remember. You've got to be within 9 inches of the center. A normal hill, I don't think I've ever seen a hill that is more than like 4, and if it was 8 inches wide, that's a pretty wide hill, because the hill is normally put this way. It's not typically put this way. I think that would be pretty odd. But if you're playing against an army, an enemy list that has a lot of shooting, you can sit just behind the hill. So that's where maybe you put to that secondary unit. So you've got your big core unit like this. You've got your smaller core unit here. And the smaller unit's just going to walk up behind, hold the hill until contested, and then the bigger unit can be used to bully the thing that comes and contests them. That might be an option to go for, depending on the matchup. But that's sort of like more if you're thinking about melee versus shooting, because you really don't want to be shot if you're sat on that hill. So outside of the core units that obviously want to fight over the center, what are we thinking? Well, this is more where you're going to start reacting to what your opponent's doing. And thinking about terrain. If your opponent is playing shooting heavy, you want to deploy to use that terrain to cover you. It sounds very obvious, but that is literally taking the thinking out of the deployment for you. You look at the board, you look at the terrain, you go, okay, cool, terrain, I can hide behind it, or I can be in it to get cover. Good stuff. If you're not, you also might want to think about where you're going to put your aggressive pieces. Are you worried that your opponent is going to be able to hold the hill? Do they maybe have like a huge brick of Chaos Warriors that's going to be quite a tough nut to crack? Cool. Well, we want to put our supportive elements on the side so they're able to come up and flank charge when we have the fight in the middle of the hill. It literally just is put units near hill and fight. This one is super simple. I think it's the most obvious one in terms of working out because there's only a single objective to fight over. So, we've got big scoring unit, we've maybe got a small scoring unit, or if you've got baggage train, you keep it over in the backfield so you can keep that and score that at the end of the game. We've got supportive, aggressive unit here that's going to come around. Maybe we've got a couple of dragons that are going to be centrally, and they're able to threaten a charge onto anything that moves onto the hill early, or can come round and, support charge in later turns. Just making itself easy for you, keeping things central, not a huge amount to say here, mostly just use the things that we talked about at the start of the, in the first sort of 15-20 minutes of the video, where we talked about the general concepts. Close quarters. This is super quick and simple. You know why? Because we've talked about basically the exact same thing when we talked about the Fields of Glory. This has bottleneck, so you can't run off the board. Cool. And then we've also got strategic locations 2 and domination. Amazing. We've already covered all of this. So what I am going to use as an opportunity to talk about is let's talk about screening your backfield. Why are we talking about screening the backfield specifically here? Because you can't come in on this board edge. Now, generally, if your opponent has scouts, you probably want to make it difficult for them to come in the front line. So, if your opponent is, let's say, looking to do something aggressive with the unit of scouts, you see this a lot less often now that scouts have been clarified to give up the +1 to go first, unless your opponent also has scouts. But let's say you're playing against dwarves, and there's a wood here, and you know what? They really love to just sit in the wood and shoot towards you like so. Well, how do you stop this? You put your unit along the board edge, you make it so that they have to be over 12 inches away from you. Suddenly the back here, they're getting less value from their ability to scout. Same if they're trying to march block you or move block you in. If your opponent is trying to pin you in the corner and they want to be sat here so they can move forwards aggressively and just sort of pin you in, making sure that you're at the edge of the deployment zone, super simple. That's how you're going to stop it. Same goes for stopping reinforcements. Reinforcements are so easy to stop, and anyone who's come from any of the other Warhammer games that Games Workshop has been, supporting over the last few years will know that reserves, that you've got to screen out like a 9-inch bubble, or you've got to protect your backboard edge. How do we do it here? Models can't come in if there is an enemy model within 8 inches of them. So if you wanted to protect this backboard edge, all you'd have to do is you'd measure 8 inches, and you put one model there. Let me make a slightly smaller brush so we can see this more clearly. So you've got one model here, and then you can use one unit of, let's say, skirmishers, and just put them interspersed 1 inch apart, like so, all the way across. In fact, you can even take up more space with less need. So you can, if you wanted to be, let me get rid of those. Yeah, if you wanted to be far forwards, you could be 8 inches up this way, 8 inches up this way, and you've got something there. You've got to make sure that there's not enough room for anyone to fit in this little gap, because obviously 8 inches up and 8 inches across is more than 8 inches diagonally. But as a general premise, as long as they haven't got enough space to put 5 models there, you're good. And then if I just get rid of these again, you put one model and you just sort of daisy chain them across. This is super simple to do. It's literally just you deploy them and then you pretty much never think about them again until your opponent's reserves come in. You can do this on both sides. You don't have to do this on both sides. You don't have to do it with skirmishing units. Like peasant bowmen are great for this. You can use war machines. If you've got like a doom diver, maybe you put one here, and maybe if I just get rid of these on this side, maybe you put a doom diver on the other side as well, like so. Boom, amazing. Suddenly, there's a huge bubble that your opponent's not able to put models into, so they'd only be able to put them into this little spot here. So what if you then have, the secondary scoring unit is going to sit here, or maybe it sits, if it's skirmishers, you can sit up like this in this sort of shape. You're in range of the objective here, you're holding it, you're still holding the back line here from enemy threats coming in, and you're making it significantly harder for your opponent to deal with you. Is this specifically a deployment thing? No, you can do this, you can respond, you can move. You don't have to be on turn 1 blocking someone out from coming in from reserves, because they can't come in turn 2. So you always have a turn to respond and move. But if you just do it in your deployment zone and you measure it out and you know that you haven't left any gaps, then you don't have to think about it for the rest of the game. And that makes the mental load of what do I have to remember much easier. And if you don't have to think about that, then you don't have to think about how am I... you've got more brain space to think about how am I beating my opponent, not just how am I stopping them from doing something pretty simple. Normally, obviously, you would also have to worry about these board edges. We haven't talked about that specifically because we're on this deployment zone. But again, if you wanted to block out your opponents on like a Fields of Glory or on, drawn battle lines, whatever it is, you can just deploy like this and take up this entire corner. And then, the closest that the enemy's going to be able to deploy in from turn 2 is like here or here. So again, you can just use another unit. You come across here. You make it so they can't get into the back lines at all. This is more or less useful information depending on which army you're playing, but you can make it very difficult for people to bring reserves in. And again, you can do this during the game. Just do it in deployment. Think about it in deployment. Then you're not going to have to think about it and stress later on during the game. Now we have a spicy one. A chance encounter, scenario 5. This is the quarters with a small circle between them. And something that's key to note is it's an 18-inch circle from, opposite edges. It's not 18 inches from, let me just get my pen tool. From here to here is significantly shorter. I haven't measured it. I probably should at some point. But it might be as low as like 12 11 to 13 inches, something in that realm. And that is significantly scarier for you if your opponent's got a full send army. Sure, they can't put, they don't have triangle bases, so they can't sit like that. But if they've got something that you're really worried about facing, like they've got a dragon, they can put it here, and they can get a charge pretty deep into your lines. So what you need to do, in my opinion, to start off with this one, is you measure out your opponent's threat ranges. This is something you should just chew as a general premise. If you're trying to play and play well, or trying to play to improve, I would recommend at the start of your turn, every turn, take 2 minutes, just measure out where your opponent can get to with their charges, and so you know what you want to avoid. Warhammer, if you're playing a melee versus melee list, is a game of, the footsie. Who gets the charge off? Who gets the value there? There are rules that modify this. Countercharge, for example, is a really good one. But in general, you'd rather be charging your opponent than them charging you. Let's not talk about the change to infantry, because that aside, you're going to be looking to try and get a charge into your opponent instead of them getting a charge into you. That's the general premise of Old World. So if you know that your opponent can put a dragon here and you're worried about it, just measure out 19 inches from this corner. Okay, so I'm going to deploy like past this line. Super easy. So again, this is important for all matchups, but usually your opponent can't threaten you on turn 1. The exception is here because you can be so close to your opponent because you're only 18 inches apart. So when you're deploying, you want to be deploying past the threat line, or if you're the aggressor, holding your threat and then putting it down after your opponent has committed something. If your opponent hasn't, respected how much aggression you can put down, and they put, let's say, I don't know, a unit of men-at-arms here, and you've got a unit of dragon princes or something that can just deploy like this, amazing. I'm probably going to be able to get the charge turn 1. Great stuff. Are there lots of factors that go into whether this is good or not? Yes, obviously. But as a general premise, if you're the more defensive player, you want to be further back and respectful of your opponent's threats. If your opponent is not respectful of your threat and you are the aggressive player, make sure you're using these corners here to get more aggressive with them. Now, the other thing to think about with deployment here is which corner do I want to go for? And this is where I really can't give you that much information because it really does come down to terrain. Just think about it in terms of terrain. Do I have, do I need a hill? Have I got war machines, but also full bricks of infantry that want to block my opponent getting to me? Okay, at that point, a hill's probably pretty good. Does my opponent have cannons and I want to protect my valuable units on a hill? Okay, great. A hill's very good because as soon as the cannonball bounces, it stops when it hits a hill. That sort of stuff is very valuable in terms of, if I've got a hill here, this is going to get a lot of value in certain matchups, depending on my army, depending on the opponent's army. Sweet. Do I need line of sight blocking? Or am I a gun line? Do I need to prevent my opponent from having line of sight blocking? Is there a lot of line of sight blocking like here and here that they could hide behind? Okay, sure. I'm not going to take this corner then. Maybe this sort of side is very open, so we're going to take the opposite corner. Just think about it in terms of which one you want to go for, looking at the terrain and then basing it from there. In terms of deployment, you can be super conservative with this, and it really depends, again, what secondary objectives you go for. Often I find there is a special feature in the middle here, which makes actually fighting around the center a little bit more awkward, which I like, because I think 18 inches, or rather like 13 to 14 inches, very, very close to be fighting over. So if you've got something like this, you can be a little bit further forwards, depending on what your opponent's threats are, but you generally want to be, again, special feature, try to go second, try to get the pressure on this map here. Domination, this is one where, again, it's super easy to play Domination. You start up pretty bundled. Later in the game, you're going to push out to these when you can. Domination, not Domination, baggage train. You're probably going to want to put the baggage train in the back sort of corner and then hold it. Where is an exception to this? If you're an aggressive list, you probably want to put the baggage train pretty far forwards so you can move aggressively forwards and you can hold it later in the game without having to run all the way into the back line, that sort of thing. What other things are we going to be thinking about? Does your opponent have scouts or reserves? If they've got scouts, deploy in the line. Don't get too close to your opponent so you can get turn 1 charge, but if you are really worried about them taking up space in the off corners of the board, like here, again, dwarves, rangers, this is the sort of deployment they love because they can just put rangers over here, make it so that you are getting pulled this way instead of getting pulled to fight their main brick over here. So makes it difficult. So you want to deploy in the line, take up as much space as possible if you can, assuming that that's not going to get you shot to pieces, obviously. Or if they have reserves that are going to come in, make sure that you're covering the back here. It can be with units, like it can be with war machines, it can be with cheap scoring units, whatever. Goes well with baggage train. Put the baggage train in the back line and then cover it like this. All of the stuff that we've talked about already. Last, but certainly not least, we have Encirclement. This is my personal favourite in terms of deployment, and I think it is the one that people struggle with the most. And that is because strategic locations 4, while you're facing opposite each other, people are going to, in my mind, play incorrectly. They're going to make life more difficult for themselves than they need to. So you're always going to see strategic locations 4. You sometimes see baggage trains or special features. Typically, I don't see special features on this, which would add quite a wrinkle to the map in my mind, because it becomes a little bit difficult to hold when you've got to do more playing around the center. But what are we looking at in terms of objectives? Well, strategic locations 4, we've got one here, we got one here, we got one here, and we got one here, give or take, roughly. So we've talked about this in the previous video. You know, if you want more thoughts on encirclement and just in terms of holding objectives, the main premise is you want to have as small of an area of control as possible. And if you're holding 4 objectives, or if there are 4 objectives on the board, in terms of being in a winning position, you need to hold at minimum 2 and contest 1, or hold 3. It's very difficult to hold 4. If you're holding 4, you've probably won the game already, so let's not worry about that as a general premise. But if you're holding 3, which 3 do you want to go for? You don't want to go for these 2 here. Ooh, let's make that line less thick. You do not want to go for these here, because this is 36 inches of distance between them. Even a dragon needs a full turn of travelling and then a long bomb charge if you're getting from one objective to the other. And, you know, if I'm holding an objective over here and you're contesting over here, it's going to take me probably 2 turns of travelling and then 1 turn of charging. So by, you know, in a 6-turn game, we can't afford to give up 2 turns. We can't really afford to give up 1 turn. So you don't want to be going for a 36-inch travel between the 2 here. That's way too much. So what do we want to go for? Well, the distance between these objectives is about 22 inches, and that's pretty friendly. Is that still a long way? Yes. Can a dragon charge from, you know, the close side of one to the close side of the other? Pretty comfortably. There's 6 inches between, so if there's a 22-inch gap with 2 sets of 6 inches, that's only actually 10 inches between the 2. And you're not realistically going to be holding the objectives from on top of it. But, you know, maybe your opponent's holding from this side and you're on this side. You're still not too far away. You might be able to go for a long bomb charge, or at worst, you'll take 1 turn of travelling to get there and you can threaten to position. So 22 inches between these 2, that makes it quite nice in terms of what you can hold. The next thing to think about is this one. This is only 24 inches. So suddenly we've got 2/3 of the distance between the, you know, this one over here and this one over here. So realistically, in my mind, if you're going for, you know, holding 3 or holding 2 and contesting 1, the triangle you want to make is this. And you always want to make a triangle with the smallest amount of sides if you've got 4 objectives to contest. Again, we're not worried about the 4th one. If you can hold all 4 or contest all 4, you've probably won the game already, or you've spread yourself too thin and you're going to, you know, turn 3 onwards, you're going to start having some difficulties. So we've got the triangle with the shortest amount of sides. With that in mind, how do we want to deploy? We probably want to deploy not as if we're going to fight the battle in this way, but as if we're going to fight the battle like this, or even like this. And the reason for that is because we're not going for this one, we don't want to put any units over here to contest it. Now, when I say we don't want to put any units over there to contest it, does that mean no units at all? No. You know, maybe you put a giant spawn over here that's going to threaten to contest it if your opponent only holds it with a small amount of models. It's not a hard and fast never do anything over here. Don't give it to your opponent for free. But when we're putting the giant spawn down, if we put it like here, for example, you could turn 1 move up to here and then threaten to move this way. But actually, you're trying to support the rest of your force that's going to the center. One of the things in Old World especially, I find, is the value of a unit is less often in when it's in combat, but it's in the potential it can do. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you've got a Duke with the heroic killing blow vow on a Royal Pegasus that's just sat out in the middle of the board. If you've got the Duke with monster slaying here, it's very difficult for your opponent to contest any of this area of the board with their monster. Why? Because you're threatening to kill it. Now, what do the maths actually say on that? The maths are in favour of, you know, killing a dragon that doesn't have any 2-up ward saves, any opal amulets. But it often takes multiple rounds of combat where your opponent could bring support in. It also is, the dragon's going to kill you over 3 or 4 turns, so you kind of have a short clock on doing it. And you've only got a limited number of dice in terms of rolling, and this is old world. We don't have huge amounts of efficiency built into our profile, so you might just fail to hit and wound. You might just, wound with everything, but you don't get any 6s to wound, you don't get any Monster Slayer rolls. So actually being in combat is actively not what I want to do with my Duke if possible. But look at the space it's controlling. If I've taken it here, my opponent doesn't want to move the dragon to here, doesn't want to move it to here, doesn't move it to one here. So if they've deployed over here, they've got a really difficult choice. Do they A, come in and risk losing huge amounts of points, which, remember, I am favoured maths-wise, or do they just come around the side or, redeploy over this way? At which point, my Duke can also move very flexibly. I'm a 360-degree charger. Again, I don't really want to be in combat with that dragon. So the actual answer is, if you're playing a dragon, just try and throttle overload your opponent. Just accept that they're going to charge you and just, hope that you've done enough damage with everything else and hope that the maths isn't in their favour on that day. That's probably how you're going to go if you're trying to push to win that sort of matchup, which is a very difficult one to match. So, general premise aside, we know that we don't want to be looking at treating it as like a sort of hammer and anvil deployment. We're going to try and turn it into more of a diagonal or long edge to long edge sort of game. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to put the bulk of our units over here. And yes, again, we can threaten to put stuff over here that could threaten this way, but is actually wanting to support over here. But in general, the bulk of our units are going to be more centrally. So, what are we looking for? Well, this objective, this is the neutral objective, but your opponent's probably going to want to contest it. If they're following the same line of thinking as you, then this is going to be a hard one to hold. So you might actually want to put a relatively beefy core unit here that can also, depending on your opponent's deployment, move up to threaten this objective. Remember, you do not have to hold your opponent's objective to be winning the game on objectives. You just have to stop them from holding it while holding 2 of your own. So you can have your core unit here, and remember that if your opponent follows the same sort of line of thinking as you, they're going to put pressure down this way. So you're probably going to want to have something beefy that can face over here or face over here, depending on your opponent's threat on the day. So we've got a core unit that is skewed more over to the right, but is sat here holding this home objective. We're going to have some sort of secondary objective holder over here. So this is your Ungor, your Peasant Archers, your Illyrian Reavers, anything that's going to be able to get to this objective on turn 1, going to be able to hold it relatively well. Hopefully your opponent hasn't put too much threat up on this side of the board, but if they have, you can match it with your own threats. You don't have to worry about it in terms of your objective holders. You can use like your Dragon Princes to go and contest this unit that's coming to fight you. Giant Spawn, any of those sort of big hitters that aren't going to score you points themselves, but are going to be able to kill opponents' units and get points that way, and help protect your objective holders. So we've got a big scoring unit, we've got a small scoring unit. Again, at this point, this is where we might start to look at putting in other bits and pieces. You might have your Giant Spawn in the center here, so that it can hold this way. If your opponent hasn't skewed much over to the right themselves, if they're more on the left-hand side from our perspective, maybe you put 1 Giant Spawn here, 1 Giant Spawn here. Or maybe you've got a unit of Dragon Princes. Maybe the Dragon Princes go here so that they can come up here, or if need be, they can come across, or they can come up to here. You basically just want to keep your mobile threats as central as possible so they're able to respond, unless you see your opponent putting stuff down in a way that you think you can punish. If your opponent is not heavily, skewed on this objective, if they think that this is going to be just held for free and they're going to go and contest this one and then also come and contest this one, maybe you just send the Dragon Princes up to their deployment and take it off them, take it off their hands, do them a favor. But yeah, this is where the obvious stuff that you put down is formulaic. This stuff is just going to be near the objectives that you want to be, and then everything else is more responding to your opponent. So you've got your aggressive units coming up here or coming up here. Jobs are good. The last thing I want to say is chaff drops are even more important on this map, in my opinion, because you can use them to threaten objectives that you don't want to put high levels of effort into. So, if you've got 2 Razor Gore here, if your opponent's trying to hold it with a brick or not even a brick, let's say they've got some Peasant Archers that are going to move up there, or they've got some Goblin Wolf Riders, something of that ilk, something that's not super resilient, but is relying on, getting there, being, difficult to shoot at because of how fast they move and being able to get behind terrain, or they're skirmish and they're going to touch terrain as well. Whatever it is, putting 104 points of Razor Gore here means that your opponent suddenly has to put a lot more effort into defending this side of the board. So that's where the chaff drops come in. And then again, this is a premise that sort of applies to the whole of deployment, but I think this is a really good place to look at it in example, because you've got so much happening on the board that having pressure coming over here can make your opponent make it so that they have to put more effort into holding their side. That brings us to the end of the video. Hope that was helpful. Hope you enjoyed. We didn't talk much about terrain over the course of the video, and that's very difficult to do because there are so many disparate, not even terrain formats. It's just a lot of events will have their own terrain packs, and or it might even be you don't have a terrain pack. It's just there is terrain on the table, and it will be arranged by the organizers, especially for smaller events. It's a less standardized thing than a lot of the other games. So if you're coming from something like 40k, you might be expecting to see terrain packs where maybe there aren't any. If there's interest in it, maybe I could do something looking at, the TSN Arena and WTC terrain packs. I don't know if those are heavily played across the globe. I don't know if that's something that people would be interested in seeing, but let me know in the comments if it is something you're interested in. And yeah, hopefully this was useful for you in terms of breaking down not just sort of the basics of how to do deployment, but hopefully there were some nuggets in there for just sort of how I think about how I think about deployment, things that you can pick up and use in your games.